It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza, good morning.
Irwin, hello.
Yes. Yeah.
Today is a singy kind of day because this is a really, well, like you say, it's a meaty subject
This
that
is really,
it's a good one.
it really is meaty. And while it's always sort of been floating around in our heads a little bit, I have to credit Esperanza, a listener who wrote into us. His name is Colin. We won't give his last name, but Colin is from Philadelphia. And Colin wrote to me, I wrote to us and said he's been interested in Robbins Island for 30 years. Apparently, he used to rent a little summer cottage in Southampton, North Sea, overlooking Great Peconic Bay, where this little Peconic Bay and Great Peconic Bay, where Robbins Island is. And he's always been fascinated by it. So, Colin, thank you very much for writing in. And any of our fans can do that if they ever want to hear a subject. It's happened in the past, but this is a good
Yes.
one, and I agree with you, Esperanza. But I guess we really should give it a geographical placement, right? So it's located, Robbins Island, between Little Peconic and Great Peconic Bays. Road runs the length of the island, can be reached by private vessel.
Yes, in other words, let's be clear, and we're going to get into this.
Yes,
It's a privately owned island.
that is correct. It is a
There is no
privately
ferry going here.
no.
It's kind of like a Gardener's Island. I don't know if you're going to get shot if you come on
That
shore,
that
but you definitely are not invited to come on to that
no.
island.
Last I checked, the North and South Ferry is not taking you here.
Correct.
So,
Yes. I mean, unless you are invited by the owner. That's
exactly. We're going to tell you about the current owner, the present day owner shortly. But, again, I'm getting some of this from really juicy tidbits from Wikipedia, actually. There were satellite images done about 15 years ago that do show some structures and a couple of outbuildings. But essentially, Esperanza, it's 435 acres off the coast of New Suffolk within the jurisdiction of the town of Southold. Okay,
Mhm.
so it is in the town of Southold, and we're not going to get too deep in here, but the history really is fascinating, and the amount of Esperanza. This is what really struck me. I think is really the amount of owners this island
Yes.
has had over the years, right?
Yes. Yes.
So we're going to just sort of run through this. Okay. It was part of a 1636 deed to William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, by King Charles, in which Alexander received all of Long Island and the adjacent islands. And it goes on. Alexander gave a James Farratt power to act as his agent and attorney in settling Long Island. And then in 1637, Farratt was allowed, this one was interesting to me, was allowed to choose 12,000 acres for his personal use. And out of all of Long Island, he chose Shelter Island and Robbins Island. Interesting, right?
Yes. Yes.
You know. Okay, and in turn sold the islands to a Stephen Goodyear, one of the founders of the New Haven colony, Esperanza. We've mentioned how Long Island, especially Eastern Long Island, tended to dialogue more with what we now call New England. Obviously, we weren't a country in 1641, but it seemed to always dialogue more over there.
Yes. There was an easier connection between, well, across the water. Let's put it that way.
That's
That
right.
was the way that there was more access.
1651, here's where it gets a little more interesting. Nathaniel Sylvester and his partners, Constant Sylvester, Thomas Middleton, Thomas Rose. Sylvester, another familiar name, Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island. Should be a podcast for another day to get into
That's a
Sylvester
great
Manor,
idea. Yes.
So, but we're going to save that. But definitely our Hamptons podcast listeners, a worthwhile place to visit. Anyway, 1715, moving right along here. Amazing. We're covering hundreds of years in about a minute or two, but it's our we have a method to our madness. Parker Wickham bought it in 1715, and Joseph Wickham, 1734, was the owner of the island. It's the son. Um, Wickham, Esperanza, very, very well-known name on the North Fork. Former Southold town supervisor was a Wickham. Matter of fact, if you recall, a few episodes ago with Mark Torres, we mentioned the Wickhams, in the Long Island about the Long Island migrant farm camps that
Labor
Mark
camps,
Torres, the
yes.
labor camps that he
Yes.
spoke of. So anyway, really just continuing to move it on, sold it to an Ezra Le Hamadou in the
L'homme
1790s.
Dieu,
Thank,
l'homme Dieu,
thank
l'homme
you.
Dieu.
We always need Esperanza really for more. I
The
really, I,
polyglot.
I really was remiss in not having her say that. So thank you. She always cleans up my mess. I always appreciate that.
Well, who knows how they pronounce it in this country, but I mean, it's a French name.
Exactly. And then he, after he died, sold it to Benjamin Horton and James Reeve. I mean, it just goes on and on. 1851, um, Worcester and Goodale owned the island. And then Ira Tuthill, this is another old Long Island name, the Tuthills, and Jeremiah Tuthill purchased parts of the island. And by 1857, Ira Tuthill owned the entire island.
I'm thinking about this as like, how did they even portion it out? I mean, it's just it's interesting
Yeah,
to learn about all these different deeds. It must be such a great rabbit hole to dive into.
completely. And again, remember, even in the late 1800s, I mean, this place was remote. I mean, this was really remote real estate, so to speak, yet there seemed to be consistent interest in it. Okay. In 1873, sold it to George Horn, acting as an agent for James Wilson, and the island was foreclosed a few years later. Even
Yes,
financial
that
struggles then.
that James Wilson was an interesting character, apparently British. So here we go, like going back to sort of loyalist hands, interestingly enough. But what I wanted to just interject here is it's a theme that we've talked about so often. This is like the rise of the resort community or the resort place that is now the Twin Forks of Long Island. Obviously, I think maybe more so South Fork, but definitely North Fork as well. But this was became like the vacation grounds for the upper middle class to higher than that, I
Su-
guess. And
such
this guy James Wilson was, he was a developer basically.
such a great point in Esperanza. And when this is not written down, but it just jogged my memory. You know, really so well said. You talk about this era. Remember, Arthur Benson in
This is
Montauk,
exactly the same time.
right?
Exactly.
Same
Yes.
time, and like the same kind of what he conceptualized a hunting lodge for
Exactly.
his
It
friends,
was, yeah. My
right?
buddies are
And
going to come out and hunt some quail or pheasant or whatever it is, and
right.
and then you start creating like this little hotel, and then it becomes more and more.
And okay, and this is a tad later, but also the Amagansett Highlands, the Procter and Gamble families from Cincinnati, same thing up by Bendigo Road, Ocean View Avenue, same concept, sort of like this manor ground with hunting quail and whatever,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
for their friends. So really great point to make. Amazing how that just jarred my memory. History repeating itself over and over. Great philosopher once said history is circular. So that's
Well, yeah, when we get to later in this story, it seemed to me like, oh, okay, this happens every 100 years or so. And then the time keeps shortening, right? Because then it's like 50 years. Then it's like we'll get to it.
exactly. We definitely will. So now we're really bringing it, closer into present day. How the island was purchased for 1.3 million in 1979 by two German investors, Herbert and
And just
Klaus.
to put it
Yes,
in today's terms, this is a whole island that in terms of, dollars in 2024 they purchased for $5.6 million.
That's correct. Okay, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. So, and these two investors were really buying it as an investment, for lack of a better term, to flip it. They wanted to sell it to private developers. And, Robert Tuthill, there's the name, was a caretaker of this island since the early 70s. So he was the person who ensured that only invited guests visited the island because he wanted to protect it from unintended wildfires set by local fishermen who apparently fishermen were sort of visiting the island illegally, I guess, right? I mean,
Well,
because it was a
they're
private island.
fishing, they get
Well,
cold, they come ashore, they build a fire, they cook a fish. I don't
right.
know. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah,
we're not
poetic.
talking commercial fishermen necessarily, just people out
Now, here's
enjoying
where it
the
really gets super interesting. Okay. We're not going to delve into too deep into how the Wickham descendants, 1989, so now this is 100 plus years later, attempted to regain the property. They actually filed a lawsuit. It was dismissed. But here's,
Yeah, a lot of politics going on here, but obviously their claim, and just it sort of in a nutshell,
please,
and hopefully I'm
no,
getting this right, was that the island was taken from their ancestors illegally because I don't know, the state of New York wasn't a state yet, and there are some legal sort of little puzzle pieces that they put together a lawsuit to regain ownership.
maybe the Wickham should have worked with the Shinnecocks and the Montaukets.
Oh,
But that's another conversation for a rabbit hole for another day. But yeah, I mean, very good point. There was, and again, this is something I remember Sarah Kaus brought up in our package. When you're trying to piece together history from 100 years ago, you're literally putting pieces of paper together. So
yeah.
it's
It
hard
really
to,
is. And what you can find and what
yes,
still exists. Yes.
exactly. So, the Wickhams made a valiant attempt, but, again, it was dismissed. And here was, Esperanza, this is really, we're going to start to get into it a little bit deeper. In what seemed like a missed opportunity, right? A month later, April of 89, Suffolk County agreed to purchase Robbins Island for $9.2 million dollars and turn it into a nature preserve. But again, it never transitioned to public ownership because of legal disputes. Another developer had signed a contract to purchase Robbins Island for 15.3 million, developing 22 luxury homes on 5-acre lots.
Yes. This was a developer from California that the Mittermeiers had sort of signed on with, but meanwhile they were going into bankruptcy. So the
So,
the, the owner
but,
of Robbins
but like
Island.
you look at this on the surface, and if you don't know the rest of the story, because the story does take a turn for the positive, you say, Esperanza, you and I would normally be lamenting another opportunity gone to preserve something like this. Once it's gone, right? I mean, that development deal collapsed. The county determined that an environmental study was necessary. The usual red tape.
Which
And
in this case was so fortunate. I mean, and yes, there should be an environmental review for this place if there was significant development to take place. So thank you, Suffolk County, for having gone there.
right. And again, now we're getting, we're going to bring in, there was a great article from a writer. This was written in the Suffolk Times of 2022, Brianne Letta, uh, currently writing for Newsday. We actually reached out to her, but she was unable to appear on the podcast with us. But she wrote a fantastic story about all this that we're going to bring in here. And, extending it from there before we get into really, to use Esperanza's term, the real meaty part, which is going to be Louis Bacon, the current owner. Fred Thiel, and this is something Brianne brought up in her article, remembered how there was this real danger of development on Robbins Island, which what we were just describing. And again, this is Fred Thiel in the late 80s. He recently retired, but had a long career in government, county legislator, Southampton town supervisor, and worked also in the New York State Assembly. And he recalled fighting along with another East End legislator at the time, Republican Greg Blass, very active in fighting Shoreham, years earlier, the nuclear plant. But According to Fred Thiel, there was never a willing seller. And
Mm.
right smack in the middle of the estuary, and this is Fred Thiel talking, it was one of the few land acquisition projects that I think all five East End towns had an interest in, because it was right in the middle of Peconic Bay, right?
Yes. Yes. And really almost, pristine environment.
But we did get Esperanza, a knight in shining armor, really, in Louis Bacon. And I mean, I think this is where we really have to get into Louis Bacon here. Now, he purchased, remember, now the county failed in its efforts to preserve it. So we're going a few years later, that was in 1989. He purchased it in 4 years later in 1993, Wall Street financier, at a bankruptcy court auction for $11 million. And now, Esperanza, it's got to be said, this was his first major purchase of doing what he did, but he's ultimately has preserved 214,000 acres nationwide, Wyoming, Colorado, all over the country. But since we're our Hamptons podcast and we're going to try to keep this as local as possible, he actually started to make efforts in restoring the island, according to, I'm going by Wikipedia, but he imported full grown oak trees to replace ones that were harvested. Non native grasses were removed. He had hunters reduce an overgrown deer population. The island had the healthiest turtle population in the state. I mean, we have to give props to Louis Bacon here, right, Esperanza?
Yes,
I mean,
indeed. Indeed.
now moving into Brienne's story about Louis Bacon, and again, this is now, we're going to quote Joe Jansen. As the world contends with the growing biodiversity crisis, Robbins Island possessed unique and significant natural and open space values. And Joe Jansen should know, was the conservation land director for the Nature Conservancy. So it provided this safe haven for all of these endangered animals and plants. And again, the fact that Bacon took this property, this was better than a county purchase in a lot of ways. Am I wrong to say that?
Well, maybe.
Well, yeah, I guess it gets into the private public. Maybe if it might have been public had, I mean, Suffolk County wanted to preserve it as a nature
Nature preserve,
reserve.
maybe. So, whether or not it would have had public access is a question. But definitely, I mean, its current status, it's a private island. So unless you're invited, you're not going to visit it. And I guess even if the county had purchased it, how much access would you really give to thousands of people throughout the year? I guess,
Right.
it's a sensitive place, right? So, but at least it would belong to the people.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to stand corrected. I'm going to withdraw my comment because Esperanza just litigated a very good case, and I think you're right.
But
I mean,
but
if we're going to,
but this is the best case scenario
yes,
as far as private ownership. Yes, I completely agree with you.
that's yet again she cleaned up my mess. So thank you for doing so. But that's really more what I meant to say. If we were going to have a private owner, this is as good as we can get as a private owner, without question. I mean, not
Yeah,
I'm gonna
because you could have a private owner who would then proceed to try to subdivide the land and sell it off, and it could, all of those things could happen that would end up being detrimental to this environment, whereas Mr. Bacon immediately put conservation easements that protect the land in perpetuity, and it's for the majority of the island. I think save 35 acres or something like that, so
exactly.
400 plus acres are preserved.
And quoting Fred
And
Thiel.
he's actively preserving them,
Yes,
I mean, he's not just letting them sit there.
that's right. That's right. And really, doing restorative things, removing non-natives. I mean, he's in,
Yes.
improving the status of the property. And, Fred Thiel in this article from the Times Review is mentioning a theme we've talked about. I mean, ad nauseum on our Hamptons podcast, how the 1980s really brought the first big development boom. Hey, look at this. I quoted Fred Thiel, and I thought I was saying my own brilliant remark. That's why I think people viewed Louis Bacon as such a breath of fresh air. Fred Thiel's going on to say, he felt, I like this term, we were under siege, and we've mentioned this kind of thing in prior podcasts with the Barcelona
Yes.
and everything else.
As I said, right? It happens. We were talking earlier about Mr. Wilson as a developer, the late 19th century, how this was the beginnings of the resort community. And then here we are, 1980s. It's like nearly, the same, it's 100 years later, we're experiencing this greater attack of development.
Yeah, and getting just to give a little background, and I'm just reading some of these quotes that he said, Esperanza. Now Louis Bacon, again, he's conservationist, philanthropist, private, as it's termed here, billionaire. Okay, no problem with that. Founder and co-chair of the More Charitable Foundation, which supports conservation nonprofits that protect threatened ecosystems. And again, we stated this already. Robbins Island was his first big purchase in 93. He was inspired by his father, who introduced him to the great outdoors, the conservation commitment of the entrepreneur Ted Turner, who also has undertaken things like this. And he's really made it his mission to preserve and protect wildlife habitats. We said this earlier, he's to this date has protected more than 214,000 acres of land. But listen to this. I really like this. This is a quote that he gave to the Suffolk Times. On my days off, I would water ski around Robbins Island and love the idea of an uninhabited natural island that had long been protected by hunters, starting with the Robbins Island Club of 1888. And when the property became available for purchase in the 1990s, as a sportsman myself, I wanted to continue the legacy of protection that previous generations had made so important.
So I just want to preface that quote, Irwin, because the fact of the matter is, Mr. Bacon didn't just swoop in out of nowhere. He had been here in the 70s,
that's right.
1970s, and had been working on a charter fishing boat. And that's how he had seen the island. He was throughout all the waters here. So that in and of itself, I really appreciate, because this is a person who did not just, he actually worked on a fishing boat.
That's right. That's
Good
right.
for
I mean,
him.
right. I mean, in a sense, yes, this is someone that, while growing up wealthy, obviously had a pedigree, obviously made a heck of a lot of money. I mean, which isn't a crime in this country. But he had sort of an everyman kind of trait to him, I think. I mean, I think that's sort of like the vibe I'm getting here in a lot of ways. Yes, I mean, look, he's not denying he was a product of privilege, but these things resonated with him. He didn't see it as he didn't see this.
It's not a taking. It's not like, oh, I'm gonna, take this and use it for my family. And it doesn't
No,
across that way at all.
nor
Right.
was he here to rape and pillage this land.
Correct.
He
Correct.
was, so there was something really nice about this. And, Esperanza, this is, if you want to talk about, I mean, look, this guy is still alive. I don't want to talk about a legacy. I mean,
Well,
but
he was 37 when he bought the island. This is, I mean, in and of
right,
itself,
which was so
notable.
that, and that we're going back 32 years. So he's still relatively a young man. I mean, could be my slightly older brother. Um, would be nice, by the
But
way.
I,
But
I,
anyway,
I want to say, I don't know where you're going with this, Erwin, but I mentioned to you earlier before we got on to record that as I was reading all this material in this story, it occurred to me, and of course, with the mention of Fred Thiel, I looked at this and I thought, okay, 80s, all right. I mean, I saw this as, wow, this sort of ushered in the tools that were implemented in the 80s, that Fred, obviously he was a big part of that, where then the county could purchase development rights, and so farmers could continue to farm their land. And we've spoken about this with Paul Goldberger recently. And then you have Thiel, who worked on the Community Preservation Fund, and what a boon that is for our communities, North Fork, South Fork, to have that source of funding, that 2% real estate transfer tax, to be able to purchase open space and historic sites, and have these really good conservation purposes and preservation purposes. And I felt, as doing this, I thought, wow, this man, this private citizen, was like a model for that in a way.
Wonder how well you know me. I'm going to tell our audience
Yeah, I
how
knew you
well
were
you.
going there.
I have to say it like that's exactly where I was going, and because there is nothing. I mean, that is the for me. And it's funny how these things on our Hamptons podcast, Esperanza, tend to happen organically quite often. Um, I really wasn't thinking about this until literally 5 minutes before, and like I was just reviewing this before we signed on. But I'm going to use Fred Thiel's own words here. You know, um, I'm not sure we would have had the Community Preservation Fund if not for the lessons that we learned in the battle to preserve Robbins Island.
Yeah, it's clear because what the Community Preservation Fund then provided, and this is not something that hadn't been done in other parts of the country, but what it provided was a planning tool. Because previously, and he talks about this, the county, the state, whatever, it was sort of ad hoc, like, oh, we gotta scramble to get money together to buy this or buy that. And then with the CPF, there's a list. I mean, not that the county didn't maybe have a list before of lands that they wanted to purchase, which Robbins Island would have been one of them, but that there wasn't the funding source to be able to do these things. So enter the Community Preservation Fund and you've got a planning tool.
That's it. That's everything here. I mean, that's the whole gist of this story for me.
I think
You know,
so as well. Yeah.
and extending on that, and this is again in Fred Thiel's own words, it's not an accident that not only the Community Preservation Fund, but things like the Pine Barrens Act
Right.
also happened after Robbins Island. I mean, like that was a dramatic pause. We do that on our Hamptons podcast. Esperanza, this was a turning point in terms of really, there have been multiple turning points over the years. We can go back to John V. N. Klein, who really started the
Mm.
farmland preservation, years before this. Republican Suffolk County executive. You know, we spoke about this, literally a guy from Smithtown, remembering growing up on a farm when Smithtown was farmland and seeing
Mm.
all the development in a plane or a helicopter. So there were these defining moments, and Louis Bacon's effort, rather than those developers that the two German investors sold to and wanted to build those estates on.
And boy, did they try to flip this property to, what was it, like from the Shah of Iran? Maybe I'm misremembering that, but from some Arab prince to Donald Trump. I mean, it really is concerning what could have happened.
That's right. What Esperanza is referring to, and this again is in this article, in 1979, those German investors tried to unsuccessfully flip it to everyone from Moroccan royalty to Donald Trump. So the efforts to flip this um, were, they were trying hard. But the bottom line was it fell into whatever dumb luck accident. He bought it at that auction. But thankfully, Louis Bacon, still stewarding this land 32 years later, and But again, really, and I think we can, Sponsor, I think we could really close on this because I don't think there's really anywhere else to go. And it's the most important point. Louis Bacon, who he was, the character, the fiber of what this person is, led to the Community Preservation Fund, influenced it, was the catalyst, I think was the term you used, and it's a good one,
Hmm. Hmm.
for the Community Preservation Fund. And again, I'm not going to mention specific names, go down these roads, but there are a lot of large landowners on Eastern Long Island, Esperanza, that if they would follow Louis Bacon's lead, right, they could really create a really beautiful legacy. I'm watching Esperanza roll her eyes right now
No,
on the
no
Zoom screen,
doubt,
but
no
I mean, but
doubt.
we know what
And
we don't want to we don't want to go down these roads, but
no, but it's true, we're not going to single any one person out or a group of them. But if more people, and there are, we have to recognize how many people have collaborated, partnered with Peconic Land
that's right.
Trust, with the Nature Conservancy, which
That's
is
right.
what Mr. Bacon did, with so many with the Community Preservation Fund. I mean, just even just private individuals who aren't multimillionaires who have contributed to preserving land in different places that is meaningful to them, to the community. And you're right, yes, he is an example. He is definitely a model. And we should mention just quickly, he also had purchased, which is a view from Robbins Island, is Cowneck Farm in North Sea, which we've talked about, the Psalms or the Rogers estate and
That's
the
right.
Port of Missing Men. And this was part of that estate. And Mr. Bacon did acquire that and also did, with the Peconic Land Trust, I believe, conservation easements. So he has been, as you just indicated, such a good steward in so many ways.
Again, and yeah, 214,000 acres to date, North Carolina,
Nationwide.
nationwide, in North Carolina, in Wyoming, Colorado, and his Colorado donation of 167,000 acres on the, I may be mispronouncing this, the Trinchera Blanca Ranch to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was the largest landholding that agency ever received. So,
Yeah.
uh, Esperanza, when this podcast airs, I'm going to find Louis Bacon's PR firm or whomever, and I'm going to just props to him and let him know. So at least two people out on Eastern Long Island, you and I appreciate all that this person has done. Honestly.
Yes, yes, he's very low profile. We don't want to abuse
Right.
his personality in any way, but we do really acknowledge what he's done in
No,
this for the whole country, but just in this area.
and just in this area, and again, if there's one takeaway we want to leave our audience, according to Fred Thiel, and no one would know this better than Fred Thiel, um, really his actions were a catalyst, to use Esperanza's term, to the creation of the Community Preservation Fund, which um, we all shudder to think if that fund didn't exist right now.
Truly,
So,
truly. Yes.
Esperanza, fantastic, meaty topic.
Yes, thank you,
Thank
Colin.
Thank you, and thank you to our listener Colin from Philadelphia. We love Philadelphia, so we're never going to say anything bad. But he really a great subject, and thank you for bringing it to our attention. And Esperanza, as always, a pleasure.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Irwin.
Bye bye. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.